Hey guys, this is John, and I'm coming at you from Zee in the Netherlands. This was a relatively last minute trip for me, but I had an opportunity here with my company, Chessable, to come over and hang out at this tournament a little bit and also record with a special guest. And I just wanted to update you about a project I've been working on for the past 3 months. I started on it in early October, and it's one of the main reasons I haven't been posting very much here on YouTube. It is a course, 100 Endgames You Must Know. It is our actually best-selling course on Chessable. We've had it for a few years now. It's published by New in Chess. It was originally a print book, released in, I believe, 2008. It's by Grandmaster Jesus de la Villa. And a few years ago, we made it into a Chessable interactive move trainer course. And people have really enjoyed studying endgames with it. And it was high time that someone made a video course for this. So that is the big project I've been working on. And as I said, it took about 3 months, over 200 individual videos going through the theoretically most important 100 endgames, as well as their deviations. So for many of these endgames, there were multiple positions and informational lines that De La Villa included. So I wanted to make sure that I did an excellent job on the content. So I kind of just holed up and started cranking these videos out. And I'm very happy with the final content. This is a book that I've learned a lot from. I've recommended it to you guys as my viewers, students, people I've come across. I really think it's a excellent endgame learning resource and a fantastic way to get that foundational knowledge about theoretical endgames. So just wanted to briefly take you through the course, what you can expect, and also we're going to look at some free material later in this video from a boot camp that I created around the 100 Endgames course. So here's the course itself. If we click into the chapter breakdown, it consists of 16 chapters. So starting with some introductory material by De La Villa, talking about his approach to the endgame. One thing that he highlights is how he wanted to make this a practical reference. Not even a reference, really, but a practical guide to endgames. So even though he does deal with the theoretical and the most important theoretical endgames, he really made a point not to make this too boring. He wanted to stress that, in his opinion, that isn't the right way to go about studying endgames, slogging through a bunch of very technical theory. So he refrains from, emphasizing certain winning or drawing zones, memorizing certain rules. So he's very explicit in how he discusses that. He starts with the basic endings. These are endings that the reader may even know. As you can see here in this first video, king and pawn versus king, dealing with concepts like the opposition and key squares, foundational knowledge. And then after that is a basic test consisting of 26 problems. And what's really cool about being here in the Netherlands is about an hour ago, I had a chance to film the basic test with none other than Magnus Carlsen, which is just a tremendous opportunity, something I'm going to be thinking back on for quite a while. Magnus took the basic test, 26 problems, and he did not get all of them correct. There's one problem that tripped him up. But these are problems that De La Villa says a first category player should know how to solve, so should have the knowledge to be able to get all 26 of them correct. But as you can see, if the world champion gets one wrong, and he just straight up picked the wrong move, as we'll see, then that tells you that these are not that simple. So after the basic test, we get into the meat of the course. There are several chapters dealing with piece versus pawn scenarios. So you can see here, chapter 4, knight versus pawn, queen versus pawn, rook versus 2 pawns. Those are all scenarios that happen quite frequently. So rook versus pawn in particular is something that stands out for me. And after these first few chapters, we get a little bit more technical. So chapter 8 is same color bishops, bishop plus pawn versus bishop. Another minor piece ending in chapter 9, bishop versus knight with 1 pawn, either the side with the bishop or the side with the knight having the pawn. Everyone's favorite opposite color bishops in chapter 10. Some really interesting stuff here. I particularly like this set of positions because opposite color bishops do have notorious drawish tendencies, but it's not always the case. This one here in ending 44 is a draw. but there are plenty of positions that you'll absolutely want to know what to do. In your games, whether you play online or over the board, it's so important to not have to think too much at important moments in these endgames. You want to have the knowledge at your fingertips where you don't have to sit there and calculate because you've already put in the work and because you already know what to look for in the position and in some cases know the precise move in the position. There are plenty of counterintuitive examples in the endgame where the correct move may be something that if you hadn't looked at it before, you're very unlikely to find over the board. So that's a big benefit to studying a resource like this. So this chapter deals with opposite color bishops. And chapter 11 is probably the most important chapter in the book. It's rook and pawn versus rook. This is actually part of the subject of the bootcamp videos. So many of you may know about the Philidor position, which we're having a look at here in ending 52, which involves, in this case, black playing rook g6 and cutting off the white king along the 6th rank. And you'll probably also be familiar with, if you studied endgames, the Lucena position, or also known as the bridge position, where the offensive side has a pawn 1 square away from promotion, and their task is how to get their king out from in front of that pawn so they can successfully promote it. And De La Villa says something, I think, kind of profound. He says that a well-played rook ending will often lead to either a Philidor position or a Lucena position, which when I thought about that made perfect sense to me, but prior to reading 100 Endgames You Must Know, that's not something that came to mind. So he starts with those examples in this chapter, works into other things like the Kling and Horowitz technique, which is a nice one that I actually asked Magnus about, and he knew the idea behind it, but he actually didn't know the name of the Kling and Horowitz position or technique, which I thought was interesting, showing that if you understand these and you've studied these, you don't really need to know the name necessarily. You just need to know the mechanics of them, how they work. So you can see here, ending 56, Kling and Horowitz. Distant effectiveness is a topic that's covered in this chapter. Highly useful chapter right here in chapter 11 with rook and pawn versus rook. Also, as far as my video content, I should just say a few words about that. So on Chessable, you can either study a course itself, or if it's a video course, you can study the video instruction along with the course itself. And the way it works is, so if I play this video here for this chapter, everything is synced up. So all of the relevant endings for this chapter are synced here to the positions. And you'll see in a second, it pops up with ending 52, position 10.1. And I'm giving an explanation of the Philidor position right here. I'm going to mute myself so you guys don't hear that again. But if we filter this, I just click this button, filter based on video, it'll show the relevant variation right down here, ending 52. And it's also possible, if we're going through the variations, if you click the little camera icon, so this is ending 60, that will sync directly and snap directly to ending 60. And that relevant video will be shown. So there are several ways to interact with the video content. And with the videos, I go through all the positions, all 100 of the endgames, all their deviations, informational lines that we have here. And in many cases, I try to add further explanations, things that have maybe worked with students of mine or how I think about it as perhaps being slightly different than what Grandmaster De La Villa, the author's explanation is. Try to really make it personal. I talk about anecdotes I've had in tournaments, in some cases where I've had some of these endings. Chapter 12 is rook and 2 pawns versus rook. Some interesting situations there, including some quite challenging material involving H and F pawn. So rook and H and F pawn, or it could be A and C pawn versus rook. These endings are usually drawish, but it depends on how far advanced the pawns are. And De La Villa goes into quite a bit of material having to do with that. So another important chapter with this one. And then finally, getting into the last set of chapters, we have pawn endings here in chapter 13. Some really good stuff here as well. I like this chapter a lot. Pawn endgames are, aside from rook endings, the most common type of ending that you're going to find yourself in. And they're often a important decision in a game, whether you should trade into a pawn ending. Actually, Magnus and I, we briefly touched on this. I mentioned that I think amateur players often trade into pawn endgames too liberally, and they don't consider the consequences of doing so. So there's a bunch of rules having to do with pawn endgames, but more so than rules, just relevant positions to show. There is one in particular where De La Villa highlights a number of different concepts. So he gives several positions dealing with king and 2 pawns versus king and 1 pawn, knight and rook pawn versus rook pawn here. And he talks about just the number of concepts that are relevant to these positions. So he says planning, reserve tempi, Steinitz's rule, which talks about the pawns being most flexible and best if they're on their original rank, because you have the option of moving them 1 or 2 squares. Opposition, anti-opposition, stalemate, key squares, outflanking. There's even something called Bird's color rule he talks about, which I had no idea about prior to studying 100 endgames you must know. So I love the fact that he brings in a number of ideas here and shows some relevant material for those. So important chapter right there with pawn endings. And then finally, towards the end, other material relations, chapter 14. This is kind of a hodgepodge of more unusual type of endings, but some you may recognize, such as the infamous bishop and knight versus king checkmate. So he gives a complete example here in ending 93, showing how to checkmate with bishop and knight versus king from the very start in a position like this where the enemy king is even centralized, and how you have to force the enemy king to the correct color corner, which is the same color corner as the bishop that you possess, and how to execute that checkmate. Also in this chapter, there is three endings devoted to rook and bishop versus rook. Highly complicated, notorious ending. So rook and bishop versus rook is typically a drawn ending, draw-ish ending, let's say. But here in ending 94, De La Villa discusses the Philidor position, which is a position that the defensive side has to avoid falling into, with their king on the back rank, the offensive side's king in opposition. And in this position here, white can win with a series of pretty complicated moves. This is one of the high degree difficulty endings in 100 endgames you must know. And I take my time explaining this to you guys. I believe the video for this particular ending is about 25 minutes long. And I try to go step by step explaining how white can win here. It involves some really subtle bishop maneuvers in particular. Everything in this course is a building block. That's what I really love about 100 endgames and why I've often recommended it and why it's been so useful for me. De La Villa just constantly builds. So after telling you about the Philidor position and what to avoid, like that one particular situation, he also shows it how it can happen on other files or ranks as well. Then he shows you the drawing technique. And endings 95 and 96 are dedicated to that. Ending 95 is on the Cochrane defense, which is a technique where the defensive side places their rook behind the bishop. He actually breaks this down into a few different parts. He shows a complete defensive example, but this is a good position that illustrates it right here. So the black rook is behind the bishop, and black is able to defend here because, unlike the Philidor position, in this case, there are 2 squares in between the kings rather than 1. And if black understands this defense, they usually hold without too many issues. So he shows that in ending 95, and then in ending 96, he shows an additional defensive idea, which is the second rank defense. So I can show that right here as well. Black playing king h3 with the idea of playing rook g2 thereafter. And it looks a little bit awkward for black on the g file like this, but in fact, there's nothing really white can do to trip black up if black keeps their wits about them. Some great stuff in this last chapter on other material relations. So after working through all 100 of the endgames, you can then take a final test, which consists of, I believe, 40... How many exercises is this? 41 exercises to solve. Some really difficult stuff there as well. It's meant to test your knowledge of the material and also throw some new positions related to the material at you. And then there's an appendix to round out the course. So a highly structured course where I think it's great for players of virtually all abilities. I mean, if you're an experienced player, these are endgames that many of which you have studied before, but there may be some new ways of thinking about them that you haven't considered. And there's just the value of drilling these positions. With our Chessable module, that's the big advantage of a course like this. You can deliberately drill these and practice what you know. If you're an amateur player or a beginner, You'll find tons of relevant information in this course, and working through it in this structured way will be tremendously beneficial for you. You could set yourself a goal of learning 5 or 10 endgames a week and make it a serious thing that you want to tackle. And inevitably, this will improve your play. So I hope this has given you a good overview of what to expect in 100 Endgames You Must Know, this course that took me about 3 months to create the video content before. And I hope you'll check out Chessable if you haven't already. This is available exclusively on Chessable, this video content. And now I'm going to show you guys some promotional material that we made related to 100 Endgames You Must Know. I created a boot camp consisting at this time of 5 positions having to do with pawn endgames and rook endgames. And it's very much in the same style as the 100 Endgames videos I made. I even add a little bit of color. Even insofar as the shirt that I'm wearing a different shirt compared to what I wore in 100 Endgames You Must Know. I actually had to wear the same shirt for about the whole 3 months when I filmed 100 Endgames You Must Know in order to give it a consistent appearance. But for the boot camp, I made an exception and I changed my shirt. So let me know what you think about that. And of course, if you ever have any comments or questions, just drop them down below in the comments section and I'd be happy to respond. So thanks for watching, guys. That's what I've been up to lately. Hope you're doing well, and check out 100 Endgames You Must Know.